My father died on a Tuesday, and by Thursday my family had already started fighting over his money in the funeral home parking lot. That's the part nobody believes when I tell this story. Not the part about the will, not the part about the company, not even the part about what he'd been hiding from all of us for 11 years. They believe that part. What they can't believe is that my own brother started talking about liquidating assets before our father's body was even in the ground. My name is Daniel Whitfield. I'm 36 years old, and until 8 months ago, most of my family thought I was a failure. I should back up. I grew up in Canton, Ohio, the younger of 2 sons. My older brother Marcus was the golden child from the day he was born. Quarterback in high school, business degree from Ohio State. Married young to a woman named Stephanie, who came from money and made sure everyone knew it. My father, Harold Whitfield, ran a mid-sized industrial supply company called Whitfield Fasteners out of a warehouse on the east side of town, and Marcus went straight into the family business after college. Everyone assumed Marcus would run it one day. Everyone assumed a lot of things about my family that turned out to be wrong. I went a different direction. I dropped out of community college after 2 years, worked odd jobs, moved to Pittsburgh in my late 20s to chase a software job that didn't pan out, and came back to Ohio at 31 with nothing to show for a decade except a beat-up Honda and a quiet kind of shame I carried into every family dinner. My mother, Carol, never said it outright, but she had a way of asking about Marcus's promotions and my plans in the same breath that told you everything about how she ranked us. My father was different. He never compared us out loud. He just watched. He was a quiet man, the kind who said more with the way he refilled your coffee than most people say in an hour of talking. What none of them knew, what I never told a single person in my family, was that in 2019, I started a small logistics software company out of my apartment with a college friend named Aaron Pruitt. We built a scheduling platform for regional trucking companies, the kind of unglamorous business nobody brags about at Thanksgiving. It grew slowly, then it grew fast. By 2023, we had 40 employees and a contract with 3 of the largest freight brokers in the Midwest. By the time my father died, the company, Root Frame, was worth just under $11 million on paper, and I owned 60% of it. I never told my family because, frankly, I didn't trust what they'd do with the information. That sounds harsh, until you understand what they had already done with far less. My father called me every Sunday at 6 in the evening for 15 years. Not Marcus. Me. I never thought much of it until later. When I understood why, the diagnosis came in March. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, the kind that doesn't give you years, it gives you months, and sometimes not even that. My father told me before he told Marcus. He told me in the parking lot of a Bob Evans on a Tuesday afternoon, both of us sitting in his truck because he said he didn't want to say it inside where waitresses could hear him cry. He asked me one question that day that I didn't understand until much later. He asked, "Daniel, if I left you something nobody else knew about, would you know what to do with it?" I told him I didn't understand the question. He said, "You will." He passed in October, 4 months after the diagnosis, faster than even the doctors expected. My mother had already started talking about the house, the cars, the business, before his body had even been moved from the hospice bed. I remember standing in the hallway of that hospice in Akron, my mother on the phone with her sister saying, "Well, Marcus will obviously take over the company, and I assume the house gets split between the boys," while my father's body was still warm 3 doors down. I didn't say anything. I just walked outside and sat in my car for 40 minutes. The funeral was on a Saturday. Stephanie wore a black dress that looked like it belonged at a gala, not a burial, and spent most of the reception afterward talking to my father's old business partner, Gerald Okafor, about transition planning for Whitfield Fasteners. Marcus stood near the casket shaking hands like he was running for office. My mother cried beautifully and performed grief the way she performed everything for an audience. I stood at the back. Nobody noticed me much. They never really had. It was at the reception, in the church basement with the bad coffee and the casserole dishes nobody would ever return, that Marcus pulled me aside and said the words that started everything. "Look, Danny," he said, using the name he knew I hated. "I know things have been tight for you. I talked to Mum, and we think it's best if you don't come to the will reading next week. It's just going to be me, Mom, and Dad's lawyer. No offence, but it's a business matter, and you've never really been involved in the business." I asked him calmly why I wouldn't be invited to my own father's will reading. He smiled the way he always smiled when he thought he'd already won. Because there's nothing in it for you to worry about. Dad and I talked about this years ago. The company goes to me. The house probably goes to Mum. I just don't want you sitting there feeling awkward. I said okay. I didn't argue. I learned a long time ago that arguing with Marcus in front of an audience never worked, because he'd just turn it into a performance about how unreasonable I was being. I let him walk away thinking he'd won something. But something he said stuck with me. He said, Dad and I talked about this years ago. My father had never once, in 15 years of Sunday phone calls, mentioned that conversation to me. I went home that night and I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about the Bob Evans parking lot. If I left you something nobody else knew about, would you know what to do with it? The will reading happened on a Thursday, 11 days after the funeral, at the office of a lawyer named Patricia Hale in downtown Canton. I wasn't invited, just like Marcus said. I didn't go. Instead, I drove 40 minutes to a storage facility in Massillon that I'd been paying for, quietly for the past 2 years. Ever since my father started sending me boxes he said he didn't have room for at the house. I'd never opened most of them. I'd just paid the rent on the unit and let them sit. Because that's what you do when your father asks you to hold on to something and doesn't explain why. I opened the first box that Thursday afternoon, while my brother was 3 towns away, discovering what our father had actually left him. Inside were folders, bank statements, stock certificates, a handwritten ledger going back almost 20 years, and a separate manila envelope with my name on it in my father's handwriting, sealed with a sticky note that said, "Open this after the reading, not before. You'll know when." I didn't open it yet. I drove home first. Marcus called me that night at 9:40 p.m. His voice didn't sound like victory. It sounded confused, almost panicked, in a way I'd never heard from him before. "Danny, did Dad ever talk to you about money, like investments or accounts you didn't know about?" I asked him what he meant. He said the will left him the house, the cars, and 40% ownership of Whitfield Fasteners. My mother got the rest of the house equity and a modest retirement account. And then he said something that made my stomach drop in a way I didn't expect, because I genuinely hadn't known what was coming next, not the specifics of it. "There's a line in the will," he said, "about a separate trust. Dad set up something called the Daniel H. Whitfield Irrevocable Trust back in 2014. Patricia Hale said she's not authorised to discuss the contents with anyone but the trustee and the beneficiary." "Danny, what is that? What did Dad give you?" I told him I didn't know. That was true. In that exact moment, I genuinely didn't know what was in it. I just knew my father had been planning something for over a decade, quietly, behind everyone's back, including mine. I opened the manila envelope at my kitchen table at 11 o'clock that night. Inside was a letter, 4 pages, handwritten, dated the week he was diagnosed. I'm not going to pretend I read it without crying, because I didn't. I cried through most of it. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere you didn't know was still raw. He wrote that he'd known about Root Frame since 2021. He said one of his old delivery drivers, a man named Lonnie Briggs, had mentioned that his nephew worked dispatch for a trucking company that used some new app built by a local guy named Whitfield. My father had looked into it, quietly. He'd watched my company grow for 2 years without ever telling me he knew, because he said he wanted to see what kind of man I'd become when nobody in the family was paying attention to reward or punish me for it. He wrote that he'd seen, over 15 years of Sunday calls, who actually showed up, not in money, in time. He wrote that Marcus had borrowed $40,000 from him in 2017 for a business opportunity that turned out to be a down payment on a lake house Stephanie wanted, and never paid a cent of it back, and that my mother knew and helped cover it up. He wrote that my mother had been quietly moving money out of joint accounts into accounts only in her name for the past 3 years, something his accountant, a man named Frank Demetrio, had flagged to him 8 months before his diagnosis, and that he suspected she was preparing for a divorce she never had the courage to ask for. Outright. And then the letter said something I read 4 times before I believed it. He wrote that in 2014, after watching how Marcus and Stephanie handled an inheritance from her grandmother, spending it within 18 months on a boat and a kitchen remodel, he'd quietly restructured the actual ownership of Whitfield Fasteners. The 40% Marcus inherited in the will wasn't 40% of a thriving company, it was 40% of a holding shell. The real operating assets, the contracts, the warehouse lease, the equipment, the client relationships, had been sold 18 months before his death into a separate entity controlled entirely by the Daniel H. Whitfield Irrevocable Trust. My trust. The one nobody but Patricia Hale and I knew the details of. In plain English, my father had given Marcus a company that was, on paper, worth almost nothing. And he'd given me the actual business. I sat at my kitchen table holding that letter for almost an hour without moving. The next part of the letter explained why. He wrote that he wasn't punishing Marcus out of cruelty. He wrote that he'd asked Marcus, point blank, in 2019, what he would do if he inherited the company outright with no oversight. Marcus told him he'd sell off the Canton warehouse, move operations to a cheaper facility in Tennessee, lay off the long-term staff, and use the freed-up capital to expand into a side venture Stephanie wanted to start, a boutique fitness studio. My father wrote that he sat with that answer for 2 years before deciding what to do with it. He also wrote about my mother. He said he'd known about the money movements for over a year before he died, and that he'd confronted her once quietly in their bedroom, and she'd told him, "Harold, I've earned the right to take care of myself, whatever that means when you're gone." He wrote that he didn't fight her on it because he was already too tired by then, and because he'd already made his decision about what mattered. The last page of the letter was the part that broke me. He wrote, "Daniel, I know you think nobody in this family ever saw you. I saw you. Every Sunday at 6 o'clock, you picked up the phone before the first ring finished. 15 years, you never once missed a call. Not when you were broke, not when you were embarrassed about it, not even the year you lived in your car for 2 months in Pittsburgh and told me you were staying with a friend. I knew, I always knew. I just never said anything because I wanted to see who you'd become without anyone watching. You became a man who builds things quietly and doesn't ask for credit. That's rarer than you know. I'm not leaving you this because I love you more than your brother. I'm leaving it to you because you're the only one of my children who never once asked me for anything in 15 years of phone calls. Take care of your mother if she lets you. Don't take care of Marcus's mistakes. He has to learn the difference between being loved and being rescued. And I never taught him that, and that's my failure, not yours, to fix. I didn't sleep that night at all. The next morning my phone exploded. Marcus had called Patricia Hale's office and demanded to know what was in the trust. She told him correctly that she wasn't permitted to disclose trust details to anyone but me, so he called me instead, 11 times in 2 hours, then finally got me on the phone screaming, actually screaming, the kind of voice I'd never heard from my composed older brother in my entire life. "What did you do, Danny? What did you do to make Dad do this? Did you poison him against me? Is this some kind of game?" I told him calmly that I hadn't known anything about it until last night, which was true. He didn't believe me. He accused me of manipulating a dying man. My mother got on the phone next and said something I will remember for the rest of my life, in a voice colder than I'd ever heard from her. "Your father was not in his right mind those last few months, Daniel. People say things and sign things when they're scared and sick. I think we need to look into whether this trust can be contested." That was the moment I understood exactly what kind of fight this was going to be. I want to be honest about something here, because this isn't a story about me being some perfect victim. For about 2 weeks after that call, I genuinely considered just giving Marcus the operating company. Outright. Splitting it. Walking away from the conflict entirely, because the noise of it made me sick to my stomach, and because some small, tired part of me still wanted my brother and my mother to just be proud of me without a fight attached to it. What changed my mind was a phone call from Lonnie Briggs, the old delivery driver my father mentioned in his letter. He called me out of nowhere, said he'd heard through the grapevine that things were getting messy with the Whitfield estate, and he wanted to tell me something before I made any decisions. He told me that 2 months before my father died, Marcus had come to the Canton warehouse and tried to get Lonnie and 2 other long-time employees, men in their 50s and 60s who'd worked there over 20 years each, to sign non-disclosure agreements about company restructuring discussions, without telling my father. Lonnie said it felt like Marcus was already planning layoffs behind Dad's back, preparing the ground before he'd even inherited anything. That's when I stopped hesitating. I hired a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Renata Cole, who specialised in trust litigation. Within 3 weeks, Marcus's lawyer sent a formal letter contesting the validity of my father's trust restructuring. claiming undue influence and diminished capacity at the time of the 2023 asset transfer. It was a serious claim. If a court agreed, the entire operating company could be forced back into the general estate and split according to the will, meaning Marcus would get a real, functioning business after all. This is the part where I have to tell you about the public humiliation, because it's the part that still makes my chest tight when I think about it. My mother decided the best strategy wasn't just legal, it was social. She started telling people, at church, at her bridge club, to anyone who'd listen, that I had isolated my dying father, manipulated him for money, and turned him against his own firstborn son in his final weakened months. She said it at my Aunt Denise's 60th birthday party, in front of nearly 40 relatives. I was there. I watched her stand up during the toast supposedly to honour my father's memory, and instead use almost the entire speech to paint me as a con man who'd preyed on a dying old man. She cried real tears doing it. People believed her because grief is a powerful disguise, and because nobody in that room had ever heard the words irrevocable trust before and had no framework to question what she was telling them. I sat there, in front of my whole extended family, while my own mother called me a predator who'd stolen from his own father on his deathbed. Nobody at that table defended me. Not one person. I left before dessert. I didn't say a word in my own defence because Renata Cole had already told me, repeatedly, do not engage publicly while litigation is pending. Anything you say can be twisted in deposition. So I sat there and took it, silently, in front of 40 people who'd known me my entire life, and chose, in that moment, to believe the worse, easier story. That night was the lowest point of this entire ordeal. I sat in my car in my aunt's driveway for almost an hour, the way I had outside the hospice, and I genuinely asked myself whether any amount of money was worth what I was watching my family become. The case took 5 months to resolve. Renata built it on 3 things: my father's handwritten letter, dated and notarized the same week as the asset transfer, which directly addressed and preempted any claim of diminished capacity, since he explicitly explained his reasoning while of clearly sound mind, sworn testimony from Frank Dimitriou, the accountant, confirming my father had been planning the restructuring methodically for over a year with full legal counsel, not on a deathbed whim. And most devastatingly for Marcus, a forensic accounting report Renata commissioned that traced over $60,000 Marcus had quietly withdrawn from the original Whitfield Fasteners operating accounts in the 4 months between my father's diagnosis and his death. Transfers he never disclosed to the estate, money that Stephanie's fitness studio had received as a loan. That last piece changed everything. It wasn't just that Marcus was contesting a will out of grief or even greed in the abstract. The forensic report showed he'd been actively siphoning money out of a dying man's company while that man was still alive to sign the checks himself, banking on inheriting the rest before anyone noticed the gap. When that report was disclosed in mediation, Marcus's own lawyer asked for a recess, and according to Renata, spent 20 minutes in the hallway arguing with him about whether to continue the case at all. The case never reached trial. Marcus settled, in writing, withdrawing his contest of the trust entirely, in exchange for us not pursuing him for the missing $60,000 as theft from the estate. My mother, facing her own exposure over the accounts she'd been quietly draining, agreed to a similar arrangement. No further contest, no further claims. In exchange for keeping the house and her retirement account intact and untouched. I want to tell you the revenge was loud. It wasn't. The revenge was a folder of bank statements and one notarized letter from a dying man who'd spent 15 years quietly paying attention while everyone assumed he wasn't. I didn't fire Lonnie Briggs or any of the warehouse staff. I gave every long-term employee a retention bonus the month the settlement closed, funded entirely from the operating profits my father had protected for them without their even knowing it. I kept the Canton warehouse open. I didn't move anything to Tennessee. Marcus and I haven't spoken since the settlement closed 7 weeks ago. My mother sent one text message. 3 words. Are you happy now? I didn't respond because the question itself told me everything about what she still didn't understand. I wasn't happy. I was just finally, for the first time in 36 years, believed by the one person whose belief I'd never had to fight for. I visit my father's grave every Sunday at 6 o'clock in the evening now, the same time he used to call. I don't say much when I'm there, I just sit. the way he used to sit, watching, not because I expect an answer, but because some habits outlive the people who taught them to you, and some debts you only understand how to repay after the person who's owed them is already gone. The last thing my father ever wrote to me was one line at the very bottom of that letter, underlined twice, and it's the only part of this whole story I think about every single day. The people who never ask you for anything are the ones who were quietly building something the whole time you weren't looking. Don't make my mistake. Look closer at the quiet ones before it's too late to tell them you finally saw them.